If no one here understands me, we don't have a deal. The words landed sharp and cold, spoken in flawless Mandarin that sliced clean through the polished silence of the private dining room. Crystal glasses trembled faintly against the marble table as every head turned toward Victor Chun, his expression unreadable beneath the soft amber glow of the chandelier. Richard Collins felt the shift instantly, like the air had been pulled out of his lungs. His practiced smile froze mid-breath, his fingers tightening around the edge of a leather portfolio he suddenly couldn't open fast enough. He had hosted hundreds of high-profile dinners in this hotel, orchestrated every detail down to the exact temperature of the room, 72 degrees, always, but nothing in his experience prepared him for this. The client was speaking, and he didn't understand a single word. Around the table, suited executives exchanged quick, uneasy glances, their confidence draining in silence. No translator, no assistant stepping in, just Mandarin flowing steadily, deliberately, like a test no one had studied for. Richard's pulse climbed, a dull pressure building behind his temples as he leaned forward slightly, nodding as if he understood, as if control had not already slipped through his fingers. He couldn't afford to look lost. Not here. Not with a contract rumored to be worth more than $20 million sitting untouched beside his plate. Of course, he said lightly, though his voice came out thinner than he intended. We appreciate your perspective. The words sounded hollow even to him. Across the room, unnoticed by most, Ava Johnson paused with a linen cloth in her hand, her motion stilled mid-wipe as the sound of Mandarin reached her ears. The faint clink of silverware faded into the background as something older, quieter stirred beneath the surface of her composure. She stood near the service station, dressed in a simple black uniform, invisible by design, the kind of presence people forgot the moment they looked away. But her eyes lifted now, just slightly, drawn toward the voice at the head of the table. The syllables were precise, controlled, and unmistakably clear. A memory. Flickered, chalk against a board, late nights under a flickering desk lamp. Characters traced over and over until they felt like second nature. Ava's grip on the cloth tightened just enough to crease the fabric. She listened again. Victor's tone sharpened, a subtle edge threading through his words as he spoke faster, more deliberate, as if testing the room, measuring its limits. Richard swallowed hard, the silence stretching too long, too loud. He glanced toward his staff, irritation flashing beneath his panic, searching for anyone who could salvage the moment before it collapsed completely. But no one moved. No one spoke. The room held its breath. And in that suspended second, somewhere between authority and exposure, Ava Johnson took one quiet step forward, her heartbeat steady, her voice still unspoken, but ready. The room did not move, but something inside it shifted, subtle and undeniable, like a current running beneath still water. Ava Johnson stood at the edge of the polished marble floor, the faint scent of citrus cleaner still clinging to her hands, her eyes fixed not on the manager, not on the nervous executives, but on Victor Chun. His words continued, measured and precise, each syllable carrying weight, intention, and something else beneath the surface that no one else seemed to hear. Ava heard it clearly, not just the language, but the warning embedded within it. Her chest rose slowly as she drew in a controlled breath, the kind she had learned years ago when silence was safer than being seen. She was not supposed to step forward. Not here. Not into a room where decisions worth more than she would earn in a lifetime were made over polished silver and quiet arrogance. Behind her, the faint hum of the service hallway echoed softly, a reminder of where she belonged, of the invisible line she was expected to never cross. Richard Collins shifted in his seat again, his confidence thinning with every passing second. He gave a tight nod, pretending to follow along, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. He tapped his pen once against the folder in front of him, then again, a nervous rhythm he could not control. One of the executives cleared his throat quietly, but no one dared interrupt. No one wanted to admit what had already become obvious. They did not understand. Victor's gaze swept across the table, sharp and assessing, pausing briefly on each face as if searching for comprehension and finding none. His voice lowered slightly, not louder, not softer, but more deliberate, as though he was offering them one final chance to catch up before something irreversible happened. Ava felt the shift in tone immediately. It was no longer a statement. It was a test. Her fingers tightened around the cloth in her hand, the fabric folding into her palm as memory pressed forward uninvited. A small classroom with flickering fluorescent lights. A teacher who spoke too fast for most students to follow. Pages filled with characters she had once copied line by line until her wrist ached, refusing to stop until she understood not just the meaning, but the structure beneath it. That life felt distant now, like a photograph left in a drawer too long, but the knowledge had never left her. It had only been buried under long shifts, quiet endurance, and the constant expectation to remain unseen. Victor spoke again, and this time there was no mistaking it. The clause he referenced, the phrasing he used, it was not neutral. It was a warning wrapped in politeness, a condition disguised as agreement. Ava's pulse steadied instead of racing. She knew exactly what he meant, and she knew exactly what would happen if no one else did. Richard leaned forward, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes. "We are aligned," he said carefully, choosing words he hoped sounded confident enough to cover the gap in his understanding. "Everything you mentioned sounds acceptable." The silence that followed was heavier than before. Victor did not respond immediately. He simply watched Richard, his expression unchanged, but his stillness carried a weight that made the air feel thinner. Ava felt it too, that quiet pause where everything balanced on the edge of a decision. She glanced briefly at the folder on the table, the edge of a contract visible beneath Richard's hand, then back at Victor. The realization settled fully now. If this continued, they would agree to something they did not understand. And once it was signed, there would be no reversing it. Her throat tightened for a fraction of a second, not from fear, but from the weight of what stepping forward would cost. Jobs like hers did not come with second chances. People like her were not invited to speak in rooms like this. But silence had a cost too. She exhaled slowly, her shoulders settling as if a decision had already been made somewhere deeper than thought. Another second passed, then another. The room remained suspended, waiting for someone to act, even if no one realized it yet. And then, without raising her voice, without asking for permission, Ava Johnson took another step forward, the soft sound of her shoes against the marble barely audible, but enough to break the illusion that she did not exist. The faint sound of Ava's step seemed louder than it should have been, a soft tap against marble that cut through the silence like a question no one wanted to answer. Richard Collins noticed it immediately. His head turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face before he even fully registered who had moved. When he did, his expression tightened, confusion quickly hardening into something colder. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low but edged, careful not to break the polished surface of the meeting, yet unable to hide the authority beneath it. Ava stopped a few feet from the table, close enough now to feel the subtle warmth from the overhead lights reflecting off the polished wood, but still standing just outside the invisible boundary that separated staff from decision-makers. Her posture remained straight, her hands steady at her sides, though the cloth was still folded neatly between her fingers. She did not look at Richard. Not yet. Her eyes stayed on Victor Chun. "Sir," she said, her voice calm, even, carrying just enough to be heard without forcing the room to react. "He is not agreeing." The words settled slowly, like dust falling after something unseen had shifted. Richard blinked once, then let out a short, disbelieving breath. "Excuse me," he said, this time louder, the edge in his tone sharpening. "You need to step back and finish your work." A few of the executives shifted uncomfortably, their attention snapping between the two, unsure whether to intervene or pretend this interruption did not exist. Ava did not move. Victor's gaze, which had been fixed on Richard, now turned toward her fully. It was not dismissive. It was not surprised. It was focused. Ava felt it immediately, the weight of being seen not as a staff member, but as something else entirely. She continued, her voice still measured, still controlled. "He is saying the terms sound acceptable on the surface," she said, choosing each word carefully. "But the structure of the agreement allows for changes after signing. Changes that would not require your approval." The room went still in a different way this time. Not confused, not uncertain, just still. Richard's jaw tightened, his hand pressing flat against the folder in front of him as if grounding himself. That is not what was said. He replied quickly, too quickly, the words overlapping with the silence instead of settling into it. You are misunderstanding. This is a high-level negotiation. It is not your place to interpret anything. Ava finally turned her head slightly, just enough for her gaze to meet his. There was no defiance in her expression, no anger, just clarity. I am not interpreting, she said quietly. I am translating. The difference landed harder than anything raised in volume. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting lightly against the table as he studied her, the faintest shift in his expression suggesting recognition, not of her face, but of her precision. He spoke again, this time directly to Ava, his Mandarin slower, deliberate, as if testing her understanding. Ava listened, her focus narrowing, the rest of the room fading into a distant blur of polished surfaces and controlled breathing. Then she responded. The Mandarin left her lips fluidly, naturally, each tone placed exactly where it belonged, not rushed, not hesitant, but steady and clear. It filled the space in a way that no one else in the room could follow, yet everyone could feel. A subtle shift ran through the executives, a ripple of realization that passed without words. Victor's eyes held hers for a moment longer, then he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Richard did not speak. He could not. The pen in his hand had gone still, the faint tapping gone with it, replaced by a silence that now carried a different kind of weight. Not uncertainty. Exposure. The last syllable of Ava's Mandarin reply lingered in the air, precise and controlled, before dissolving into a silence so complete it felt deliberate. No one moved. No one reached for a glass, a pen, or even a breath that might break the moment too soon. Victor Chen remained still, his gaze steady on Ava, as if measuring not just her words, but the certainty behind them. Then, slowly, he shifted his attention back to Richard Collins. The movement was subtle, almost effortless, but it carried weight. Is that your understanding as well? Victor asked, this time in clear, unaccented English, his tone calm, but unmistakably direct. Richard felt the question before he processed it. His throat tightened slightly, the confident rhythm he had relied on all evening now completely gone. For a fraction of a second, he considered repeating what he had said before, doubling down on control, on appearance, on the illusion that nothing had slipped. But the room had already changed. Every eye was on him now, not waiting for leadership, but waiting for truth. He glanced at the contract in front of him, the clean lines of text suddenly unfamiliar, as if the words had rearranged themselves when he was not looking. The agreement outlines standard flexibility, he said carefully, choosing each word as if stepping across thin ice. Nothing outside of expected parameters. Ava did not interrupt. She simply stood there, her presence no longer invisible, her stillness sharper than any argument. Victor's expression did not change. He turned slightly toward Ava again and spoke in Mandarin once more, his tone quieter now, but layered with intent. Ava listened, her eyes steady, her breathing even. When she responded, her voice matched his calm, her Mandarin just as clear, just as deliberate. She did not raise it. She did not soften it. She simply translated. He says the clause allows unilateral adjustments after execution, she said, returning to English without hesitation, and that those adjustments could affect ownership percentages without requiring a secondary signature. The words landed heavier than before, not because they were louder, but because they were specific, measurable, real. One of the executives leaned forward slightly, his brow furrowing as he reached for a copy of the contract, flipping pages with quick, controlled movements. Another followed, the quiet shuffle of paper breaking the stillness in small, precise sounds. Richard felt the shift spreading across the table, the subtle collapse of the narrative he had tried to maintain. He opened his folder at last, scanning the lines he should have known, his eyes moving faster than his understanding. That is not, he started, but the words faltered, losing shape before they could form into certainty. Victor watched him for a moment longer, then reached forward and turned the contract slightly, aligning it with the light. His finger traced a section halfway down the page, stopping on a paragraph that, moments ago, had seemed insignificant. This section, he said, tapping it once, not forcefully, but with enough clarity that no one could ignore it. Explain it. Richard leaned in, his vision narrowing as the lines of text sharpened under scrutiny. The legal language was dense, layered, but now that he was looking at it through the lens Ava had provided, something shifted. A phrase that allowed amendments. A condition that removed the need for joint approval. A structure that, if used precisely, could alter the balance of the agreement without immediate notice. His breath slowed, not from calm, but from realization. The room did not rush him. It did not need to. The truth was already there, unfolding line by line. Ava remained where she was, her hands relaxed at her sides, her role unchanged on paper, but entirely transformed in reality. She did not look at Richard again. She did not need to. Victor leaned back once more, the faintest hint of acknowledgement settling into his posture. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, but undeniable. The power in the room had shifted, not with noise, not with force, but with clarity. And for the first time that evening, the silence no longer belonged to confusion. It belonged to understanding. The realization did not arrive all at once for Richard Collins, but in fragments, each one heavier than the last, settling into place with a quiet certainty he could not ignore. His eyes remained locked on the paragraph Victor had indicated, scanning the same lines again and again as if repetition might somehow change their meaning. It did not. The language was clear now, unmistakable in its intent, and far more dangerous than he had initially believed. Around the table, the subtle rustle of paper continued as the other executives followed along, their earlier confidence replaced with sharp focus, their silence no longer passive but analytical. One of them adjusted his glasses, leaning closer, his finger tracing the same clause, stopping at the same point Ava had identified. No one spoke. They did not need to. The evidence was sitting in front of them, printed in clean, formal text that now felt anything but neutral. Richard felt the weight of their attention shift toward him again, not openly, not dramatically, but enough to make the air feel tighter. He straightened slightly in his chair, his posture attempting to recover some form of control, even as his grip on it continued to slip. "This appears to be a standard provision," he said, though his voice lacked the steadiness it once carried. "It allows for flexibility during implementation." The words sounded rehearsed, detached from the reality forming in front of him. Ava did not react. She remained still, her presence grounded, her eyes calm, not challenging, not pressing, simply present in a way that made avoidance impossible. Victor's gaze moved between them once more, then settled back on Richard, patient, but no longer accommodating. "Flexibility," Victor repeated slowly, as if testing the word itself. Then he turned slightly toward Ava again and spoke in Mandarin, his tone sharper now, carrying a subtle edge that had not been there before. Ava listened carefully, every detail landing with clarity, her understanding immediate. When she spoke, her translation came without hesitation, her voice steady, each word placed with precision. "He says flexibility is only acceptable when both parties retain equal control," she said, "and that this clause removes that balance entirely." The shift in the room deepened. One of the executives exhaled quietly, a sound that carried more weight than any interruption could have. Another closed his folder slowly, as if acknowledging that the conversation had already moved beyond negotiation into something more fundamental. Richard felt it clearly now, the unraveling of the structure he had built around the meeting, the careful confidence that had guided him through countless negotiations now replaced by something unfamiliar. Not panic, not yet, but exposure. He glanced once more at the contract, then back at Victor, searching for a way to recover, to redirect, to regain ground that had already slipped away. "We can revise the language," he said, this time more quickly, the words arriving with urgency rather than control. "Adjust the clause to ensure mutual consent." That was always the intention. The statement hung in the air, offered as a solution, but arriving too late to erase what had already been revealed. Victor did not respond immediately. He leaned back slightly, his fingers resting lightly against the arm of his chair, his expression composed but distant, as if he were now evaluating something beyond the contract itself. The decision had shifted from the document to the people presenting it. Ava felt that shift as well. It was not loud. It was not obvious. But it was there, in the way Victor's attention no longer searched for clarity, but for integrity. The room held still once more, But this time the silence was heavier, more final, like a door that had already begun to close. Richard's shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, the realization settling deeper with every passing second. This was no longer about saving the deal. It was about whether it should have been trusted in the first place. And in that quiet, undeniable moment, the balance of power had not just shifted. It had been completely rewritten. The silence that followed did not break, it deepened, settling into the room like a weight no one could lift, not even with words. The faint hum of the air conditioning became noticeable now, a low, steady presence beneath everything else, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Victorchin did not move. He did not rush to respond, did not acknowledge Richard's attempt to recover the situation. Instead, he simply sat there, still, his gaze lowered slightly toward the contract, but not reading it anymore. The decision had already moved past the paper. Ava Johnson felt the shift more than she saw it. It was in the stillness of Victor's hands, in the way his posture no longer leaned forward in negotiation, but settled back into quiet observation. She remained where she was, her shoulders relaxed, her breathing even, the cloth still folded neatly in her hand. The tension that had once pressed against her chest had faded, replaced by something quieter, something steadier. Not relief. Not yet. Just clarity. Across the table, Richard Collins sat rigid. The lines of control he had relied on now fractured, visible in the tightness of his jaw and the slight stiffness in his shoulders. He glanced briefly at the executives around him, searching for support, for alignment, for anything that might restore the balance he had lost. But no one met his eyes. They were focused on the contract, on Victor, on the space where the truth had already settled. One of them adjusted his tie slowly. Another closed his folder with deliberate care, as if signaling the end of something that had not been formally concluded. The room was no longer waiting for an answer. It was absorbing one. Victor finally moved, but only slightly, his hand lifting from the armrest to rest lightly on the table. His fingers traced the edge of the document without opening it, without returning to the details that had already been exposed. Then, without looking up, he spoke in Mandarin again, his voice softer now, stripped of the earlier edge, but carrying something deeper, something reflective. Ava listened, her attention steady, her understanding immediate. The words were not about clauses anymore, not about percentages or conditions. They were about trust, about intention, about what was revealed when pressure replaced comfort. Ava did not respond right away. She let the silence hold for a moment, let the weight of his words settle fully before she translated. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but just as clear. He says the agreement itself can be rewritten, she said, her tone even. But trust, once broken, cannot be revised as easily. The sentence lingered, not sharp, not aggressive, but undeniable. Richard felt it land in a way the earlier revelations had not. This was no longer about misunderstanding language. This was about judgment, about the way he had handled the moment when it mattered most. He opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, but no words came. There was nothing to correct, nothing to clarify. The silence filled the space where his voice had once been. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, not in submission, but in quiet respect for the moment. She did not step back yet. She did not return to the service station. She simply stood there, present, no longer invisible, but not claiming anything either. The light from the chandelier reflected softly across the polished surface of the table, catching the edge of the contract, the stillness of Victor's hand, the quiet tension in Richard's posture. Time seemed to stretch, each second passing without urgency, without movement. And in that pause, something shifted again, not dramatically, not visibly, but deeply. The noise of status, of hierarchy, of assumed authority had fallen away, leaving only what remained underneath. A man who had nearly signed something he did not fully understand. Another who had tried to control what he could not interpret. And one who had simply spoken the truth when it mattered. The room did not need anyone to say it out loud. It was already clear. The power had not just moved. It had settled somewhere new, somewhere quieter, somewhere that did not depend on titles or positions. And for the first time since the conversation began, the silence felt complete. Victorchin finally lifted his gaze, not toward the contract, not toward the executives, but directly toward Ava Johnson, and for a moment the room seemed to narrow to just that line of sight, quiet and deliberate, as if everything else had faded into the background. His expression was not dramatic, not softened into gratitude, but there was a shift there, subtle and unmistakable, the kind that did not need to be announced to be understood. Then he turned his attention back to Richard Collins, and this time there was no hesitation in his voice when he spoke in English. "You were prepared to finalize this agreement tonight," he said, his tone calm, but carrying a clarity that left no room for interpretation. It was not a question. Richard straightened slightly, instinctively, as if posture alone could restore what had been lost, but the words that followed came slower than he intended. "We believe the terms were aligned," he replied, carefully choosing language that avoided direct admission while offering just enough acknowledgement to remain credible. Victor watched him for a second longer, then nodded once, a small motion that seemed to close something rather than open it. "Belief is not the same as understanding," he said, his voice even, measured, but final. The statement settled into the room with quiet authority, not raised, not emphasized, but impossible to ignore. One of the executives shifted in his seat, the leather chair creaking softly beneath the movement, as if the tension had finally found a place to land. Another exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that signaled acceptance rather than resistance. The structure of the evening had changed, and everyone in the room felt it, even if no one said it aloud. Victor reached for the contract at last, not to review it again, but to close it. The soft sound of the folder being shut carried further than expected, marking the end of something that had once seemed inevitable. He placed it neatly on the table, aligning it with deliberate precision, then rested his hand lightly on top of it, as if sealing the decision without needing further confirmation. "We will not proceed under these terms," he said simply. There was no anger in his voice, no accusation, just a statement of fact that carried more weight than any raised tone could have. Richard felt the finality of it settle in his chest, not sharp, but heavy, like something that could not be undone. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, the instinct to negotiate replaced by the understanding that the moment had already passed. Across the table, the executives did not argue. They did not attempt to salvage the agreement. They simply absorbed the outcome, their focus shifting from persuasion to reflection. Ava remained still, her presence unchanged, her role still unspoken, yet undeniably central to what had just occurred. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at the executives. Her gaze remained steady, neutral, as if she understood that the moment no longer required her voice. Victor's attention returned to her once more, and this time, when he spoke, his tone carried something different, not authority, not evaluation, but acknowledgement. "You prevented a mistake tonight," he said, his words clear, direct, and without embellishment. Ava did not react immediately. She held the moment quietly, letting it pass through without shifting her posture, without stepping forward or back. "I just translated what was said," she replied, her voice calm, grounded, refusing to claim more than the truth. Victor studied her for a brief second, then inclined his head slightly, a gesture small enough to be missed, but deliberate enough to carry meaning. Not a performance, not a formality, just recognition. Richard saw it, and something in his expression tightened again, not from anger, but from the quiet realization of what had just happened. The hierarchy he had relied on had not protected him. It had blinded him. The room did not erupt into conversation. It did not rush to fill the silence. Instead, it remained still, holding the weight of what had been revealed, what had been avoided, and what had been lost. And in that stillness, the shift was complete, not marked by noise or reaction, but by the quiet understanding that truth, when spoken at the right moment, does not need permission to change everything. No one stood up right away. The meeting did not dissolve into handshakes or polite, closing remarks the way it usually did. Instead, the room remained, suspended in a quiet that felt earned, as if every person present understood that something more important than a business deal had just taken place. Victor Chin slowly removed his hand from the closed contract and leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed now, no longer carrying the weight of negotiation. His gaze drifted once more across the table, briefly acknowledging the executives, then returning to Richard Collins. There was no hostility in his expression, but there was no softness either. Just clarity. You run a refined operation, Victor said evenly, his voice calm, measured, but carrying a quiet authority that filled the room without effort. Everything appears precise, controlled, impressive. Richard gave a small nod, unsure whether the words were praise or something else entirely. We take pride in our standards, he replied, his voice steadier now, though still lacking the confidence it once held. Victor paused for a fraction of a second, then continued, but precision without understanding is just performance. The sentence did not rise. It did not need to. It settled into the room with a quiet weight that no one could ignore. Richard lowered his gaze slightly, the meaning landing fully this time, not as a challenge, but as a truth he could not deflect. Ava stood where she was, her presence unchanged, her hands still, her breathing steady. She did not react to the exchange. She did not look for recognition. She simply remained grounded in the same quiet space she had occupied from the beginning, even though everything around her had shifted. One of the executives slowly gathered his papers, not hurried, not abrupt, just deliberate, as if acknowledging that the purpose of the meeting had already been fulfilled in a way no one had expected. Another followed, closing his folder with care, the soft click echoing faintly against the marble walls. The room began to move again, but differently now, not driven by agenda, but by reflection. Victor's attention returned to Ava once more, and this time there was no distance in his gaze. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried a different kind of weight than anything else. Spoken that evening. Ava met his eyes calmly. "Ava Johnson," she said. Victor nodded once, committing it to memory, not as a formality, but with intention. "You have training," he said, not as a question, but as an observation. Ava hesitated for a brief moment, not from uncertainty, but from consideration. Then she answered honestly. "I studied international business and Mandarin in college," she said. "I had to leave before finishing." The words were simple, but they carried a quiet history behind them, one that did not need explanation. Victor absorbed that without interruption, his expression unchanged, but attentive. Richard looked up at that, something flickering across his face, a realization that extended beyond the events of the evening, reaching into assumptions he had never questioned. He opened his mouth slightly, then stopped, as if the words he might have said no longer felt appropriate. Victor leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, his focus steady on Ava. "And now you work here," he said. Ava gave a small nod. "Yes, sir." There was no bitterness in her voice. No apology. Just fact. Victor remained silent for a moment, the kind of pause that was not empty, but thoughtful. The light above reflected softly against the polished table, catching the edge of the closed contract, the stillness of the room, the quiet presence of a woman who had just altered the outcome of something far beyond her job description. Then Victor spoke again, his tone unchanged, but carrying a new direction. "That should not be the end of your story." The words were not dramatic. They were not delivered with emphasis, but they landed with a quiet certainty that carried further than anything raised in volume. Ava did not respond immediately. She held the moment, her posture steady, her expression composed, as if she understood that what had just been offered was not a reward, but recognition. And recognition, once given, had a way of changing everything that followed. No one rushed to leave. The chairs remained slightly pulled back, the folders half closed, the glasses untouched, as if the room itself needed a moment longer to settle into what had just taken place. Ava Johnson stood quietly where she was, the folded cloth still in her hand, her role unchanged in title, but no longer in presence. The chandelier above cast a steady, warm light across the polished marble, reflecting softly against the table where the contract now rested, closed and final. Victor Chen rose from his seat without urgency, the movement calm and controlled, his posture carrying the same quiet authority that had guided the entire evening. He adjusted his jacket slightly, then looked once more at Ava, not as someone passing by, but as someone acknowledging a moment that would not be repeated in the same way again. There were no grand gestures, no extended speeches, just a simple pause, long enough to be felt. Then he inclined his head again, just slightly, before turning toward the exit. The executives followed slowly, gathering their things in silence, their earlier confidence replaced with a quieter awareness. One by one, they moved toward the door, their footsteps soft against the marble floor, their conversations absent, as if words would only interrupt what had already been understood. Richard Collins remained seated for a moment longer, his hands resting on the table, his gaze fixed on the spot where the contract had been. The room that had once reflected his control now felt different, not hostile, not unfamiliar, but changed in a way that could not be reversed. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to reveal something beneath it, something closer to reflection than frustration. After a few seconds, he stood, his movements measured, deliberate. He looked toward Ava, not with authority this time, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, something he was still learning how to carry. "Miss Johnson," he said, his voice steady, though softer than before. Ava turned slightly toward him, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. "Yes, sir," she replied. Richard hesitated for a fraction of a second, as if choosing his words with more care than he ever had in this room. "You should not have had to step in tonight," he said. It was not quite an apology, not fully, but it was not what he would have said before. Ava held his gaze for a moment, then answered simply. Someone needed to understand what was being said. The words were not sharp, not pointed, just true. Richard nodded once, slowly, the meaning settling in without resistance. He did not argue. He did not correct. He simply accepted it. The distance between them had not disappeared, but it had shifted, reshaped into something quieter, more honest. Ava lowered her gaze slightly, then turned back toward the table. The room was nearly empty now, the echoes of the meeting fading into the background. She stepped forward, placing the cloth against the smooth surface, wiping away a faint ring left by a glass that had never been finished. The motion was steady, familiar, grounding. Outside the tall windows, the city lights stretched into the distance, steady and bright, reflecting against the glass like a second world layered over the first. Inside, the air felt different, lighter in a way that did not need explanation. Richard watched her for a moment longer, then turned and walked toward the door, his steps quieter than before, his presence no longer filling the room the way it once had. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Ava alone in the quiet space. She finished wiping the table, smoothing the cloth once more before folding it carefully in her hands. For a moment, she stood still, her reflection faintly visible in the polished surface beneath the light. Then she turned and walked toward the service hallway, her steps soft, her posture unchanged, her presence calm. The room remained silent behind her, but it was not empty. It held the echo of something that had shifted without noise, something that would not be forgotten, not by those who had witnessed it, and not by the one who had simply chosen to speak when it mattered. And as the lights reflected gently across the marble and glass, the quiet that remained was not absence. It was resolution.